you so much. And thank you to Fast Forward Futures for getting this virtual summit off the ground in such short notice with such an incredible range of guests from all over the world. Really, really cool to be a part of this. So what I would like to spend some time speaking to all of you about is how to think about the future in a global pandemic, something very simple as every single talk is in this summit. I've been in the futures field for about 12 years, and what I found was that as the whole world faced a lockdown, I had to actually rethink my approach to futures thinking and what it means to be a foresight strategist. And so what I'll be sharing with you all is very kind of new and fresh thinking for me. It's not practiced, it's very in theory. So looking forward to any kind of thoughts that you might all have as well. An alternate title to this talk could be How to Stay Sane When Everything Seems Possible. And so the shift that I noticed in my own thinking during this period is that my entire career in the space has been focused on helping people who I'm working with think more broadly about possibilities, to have a bigger scope in terms of what they understand to be possible, to have a wider view, to have a broader periphery, to make patterns that they weren't able to see before, to make connections that they weren't able to see before, to see alternative futures that were not present before. And what I'm finding is that doesn't really seem to be helpful anymore, at least not in this current moment. It probably will become helpful again. And part of the reason is because we are just facing such an incredible range of possibilities. These are 5 articles that popped up all within 2 weeks of each other, each one talking about how the world will never go back to what it was before the pandemic. And if you read through these articles, as I have done, you will find that there are at least 121 different possible futures that emerge within those 5 articles. And many of these articles have a US bent, so they're pretty specific to potential impacts from COVID-19 on the US. Many of them are also somewhat global in nature. And the craziest thing is that many of these are contradictory, and most of them have some sense of truth in them, some sense of possibility, some sense of reality. And it's maddening. I mean, it's really, the level of complexity and uncertainty and disruption is just at such a large scale that I was realizing now is probably not the time to work to expand our aperture of the possible, to expand our understanding of what's possible. Now is maybe a time to try and hone in on what feels more solid. And this, of course, coming from a vantage point of working within a for-profit business, where the focus is a little bit more, it's obviously driven towards making sound business decisions and not necessarily around understanding the whole range of possibilities. And so in that environment, it becomes increasingly important to kind of quiet the noise. And what I find is that with this many possibilities, it just makes us neurotic in our thinking and unable to make any decisions. And at the same time, it's a good reminder that the future is subjective. There is no real one true future out there. Any kind of potential scenario or outcome that someone writes about or thinks about, it is based on their personal beliefs, their personal biases. And that is why you can have two scenarios side by side that talk about increase in militarization, and another one that talks about actually a decrease in militarization as a result of a global shutdown and pandemic. And so that's just a really important thing to remember as you're reading all of the possible impacts, all the possible scenarios from this moment in time, is whoever is writing it, their own values, their own biases are coming forward. And we need to recognize that. And if we are in the activity of trying to develop our own scenarios, we need to, of course, be very, very cognizant of our own biases and how they're showing up in those potential outcomes. Now, there's one quote from the 5 articles I posted earlier that I think is probably, out of the 120 plus potential futures coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is probably the most insightful statement that someone wrote. My educated guess is that we'll see a little of everything, depending on where people live, especially because the pandemic is going to hit local communities unevenly. So that's another good reminder. Not only is the future subjective, but it's going to unroll, if you will. It's going to look different in different places based on how we are experiencing this current moment. And so pay close attention to what's happening at local level and what's happening where you are, whether it's your organization, whether it's your community, whether it's your country, and make sure to filter everything that you're learning through your own locality and to understand that it's going to be different. And that's just the nature of the world. Now, so this is a picture of a supernova from NASA. And this is kind of what the moment feels like to me right now. It's just an absolute explosion of possibilities. And as I was saying, it is maddening, and it's creates a neurosis, a neurotic way of thinking about things that makes it impossible to actually find comfort, to make decisions. It makes thinking about the future a place of discomfort, not a place to find comfort and ease and to understand how do we move forward. And so how do we make sense of all of these endless possibilities? And this is kind of where my thinking is emerging, and in the way that I'm thinking about, rather than trying to come up with all the possibilities, how do we actually narrow them down to things that feel a little bit more in line with the plausible? And it's very interesting saying this because it kind of goes against all my basic instincts as a foresight strategist. My experience, my practice, my skills have never been about that. It's always been about just trying to get to all the alternatives. And, you know, there's always this large dialogue around futures thinking is not prediction. We are not able to predict the future. The future does not exist. It is not a destination to arrive at some point. It is a concept that we use to our own benefit, to our own services. And typically we use it in order to learn new things, to widen the aperture of the possible. And so it's very hard for me to say, in this moment, we might actually want to be saying, what seems more possible? What seems more plausible? And to do that without trying to actually put numbers, percentages, weights on that. But to just keep that in mind as a general guideline, if you will. And so these are the kind of 5 ways to help filter through some of the noise that I've been thinking through. And I'll just run through them So when we talk about the historical context, this is just a general rule of thumb, right? We always want to take history and what has preceded us into our view when we're thinking about what's possible in the future. But in this moment of just massive uncertainty and disruption, it's incredibly important to think about the historical context, because this is actually, I think, a place of comfort at this point. Because when we look at history, we see that we have, as humans, dealt with mass disruption in the past, and life still goes on. The basic fundamental necessities and desires of life, for those of us who make it through, they still go on. And putting it in historical context, I think, can be very comforting and helpful. So I want to, in that vein, share this article from The New Yorker from the other week. In this article, Jill Lepore talks about, she writes what our contagion fables are really about. So she explores contagion literacy, I think starting from the 1300s, and I think ending in around the 1990s. And there's an interesting theme that came out of this article for me, which is that in all of these pieces of writing that she explored, she finds exactly what she writes in the subtitle here, that everybody is deeply concerned about the loss of knowledge, the loss of books, which I think is why the illustration is someone reading a book through a fully contained personal protective equipment. So throughout all of the writings, the kind of ultimate outcome of a massive global pandemic is a fear of the loss of profound knowledge and a total regression in human society. And I have not seen that in any of the current stuff that's coming out. It's possible that I've missed them, but I think because, in fact, none of the literature that she really looked at was post-internet. So we have reached a point where our collective human knowledge lives beyond us, essentially. And we've maybe moved past a point where we're going to worry about losing our knowledge as a human society, and go back to the real basics of having to live off the land and farm and essentially start over. What I am seeing is that there is some thinking around how the long-term impacts of a global shutdown essentially is going to impact trade and globalization and industrialization. So it seems like that's kind of the regression point that we're thinking about nowadays, as opposed to going all the way back to, you know, pre-books and pre-writing and pre-reading. It's, are we actually going to lose the globalized infrastructure that we have built since industrialization? And what does that look like? The other piece I want to draw our attention to in terms of a historical point of view or context is this tweet from Nils Gilman. And I don't have the source for this quote, but Nils is very trusted. So if he does share that, I'll send it along in the notes for this PowerPoint. But what I want to point out in this is he is sharing, I'm guessing it's a screen grab from his iPad. He's reading some book on his iPad, obviously. And he's looking at how the socioeconomic conditions primed Europe for a catastrophic bubonic plague of the 1340s. And in this text, it says, heavy burdens of taxes, rents, tithes, and labor duties left little surplus for ordinary people. The #1 priority for the upper classes and the central power was to keep up their luxury consumption and lifestyle, while little resources were reinvested back into the agricultural system. When they experienced declining incomes due to poor yields, their immediate reaction was to compensate by further raising taxes and rents. And it's just as Nils Gilman says, this feels very similar to the discussions that are happening today. There's a lot of, the shutdown is highlighting some deep socioeconomic inequalities. And it's highlighting the true fragility of poor and working poor around the world. And so there are two kind of potential futures that are emerging from this. And just to really simplify, one is we get ourselves together and we fix the economic system and make people whole and stable and financially secure. And the other one is we actually just kind of chop off the bottom or empty out the middle even more and create increased inequality. And the reason why I place this in the historical context, in this case of the 1340s, is to remember that just because there's a good idea, just because this is something many of us feel urgently and powerfully about, doesn't mean that the change will come. And that's just kind of a reality that we all need to come to terms with. Unless, of course, we do the work to make the change come. So the next step, if you will, in order to help us make sense of just this utter explosion of possible futures, is to track push factors. It is apparent to me that the lockdown is, and I want to say the lockdown, not the pandemic, it's kind of the actions that we have taken in light of the pandemic, is forcing a lot of, fast tracking a lot of transformations that were already underway. And I think these are really important to pay attention to, because these are trends or movements, transformations that people have already been working towards and building towards, and now they're just being pushed into the fast lane. And I think we have these on a global scale, probably have them in your own company or your own organization, in your own school, maybe you have them in your personal life. And those are really fruitful spaces to think about. Yeah, this probably has legs past the lockdown. So some of these push factors include flexible work. And I mean, everything that goes along with flexible work, having virtual access to work, virtual collaboration, having having work based on getting things done as opposed to strict 9-to-5 butt-in-seat structures that we're used to. In the US, we're seeing prison reform, maybe having some fast track motion as a result of the lockdown, as we're having to think more carefully and critically around who should be in prison and who maybe we should release. There's been a fast tracking, obviously, of virtual life. Hello, we're all here together. Pleasure to meet you and be together. Digital government, that's fast tracking. And there's been a lot of pushback against that for a long time with a lot of vested interests. There's also, I would also look at things like anti-immigrant sentiment and nationalistic fervor. That is something that there have been movements in that space increasingly over the last 5 or so years, I would say, and they're finding a voice in this as well. So it's not all positive, right? I'm not saying any of these are good or bad, they just are. And that's an important piece of making sense of all of this, is trying to keep your own biases and subjective opinions out of it for now, just in terms of trying to understand what's happening, not in terms of making your decisions around how you want to act. And another push factor that I'm tracking is what's been called the shut-in economy. Essentially, all of the services that we are now making massive use of because we're all literally shut in. So everything from delivery to just incredible consumption of media from within our homes. And so that's something that's been building and growing for a while, and now it's just taken off. And I don't expect that's gonna, backtrack. It's then just a question of to what extent is it gonna take off? So the next step would be to uncover incentivizing and enabling systems of change. And this is a much more complex exercise to undertake. But the question is, when a potential future is suggested, is the foundation in place to make it happen? Are the financial incentives aligned? Are the enabling political structures already in place? Is it simply a good idea that we wish would happen? Or are the roots already in place that would allow it to take off? If the incentivizing or enabling systems are not in place, then it's not that it won't happen, it's not that it can't happen, it's just that it would require a lot of work to get it done. And so unless you are doing it, or someone who you are tracking, working with is doing the work, building that foundation, changing economic models, changing political systems, then just because we're in a global lockdown, feels very silly saying just because we're in a global lockdown, that is a momentous occasion. But because we're in this moment of mass disruption and uncertainty, doesn't mean that everything's going to happen. It does open the window of possibility, but you still need someone who's doing the work of making the change happen. And so dive into those scenarios and look for, well, is the foundation there? If it's not there, who's doing the work to actually build it and make that happen? And kind of, this is a bit of a subset to the other slide, is tease out awakenings. And I heard someone using the term awakenings on the radio the other day, and it struck me as a really useful term. I'm finding that there are a lot of moments where I hear people realize something out of this pandemic. And it's great to have a new insight, to have new knowledge, but knowledge does not equal change. Some of the awakenings that I'm coming across include the fact that there's gender inequality, and that in a total lockdown, a lot of work falls on women. They fall on mothers, they fall on women, and that many, at least in the US, I don't know what the numbers are, but a huge percentage of healthcare workers are women. And so women are taking a huge burden on in this current moment, and we're typically not recognized for the burdens that we take on. This is especially the case for parents with children at home who are having to homeschool them. We still live in a time when that tends to fall on women's shoulders. And so that's a fantastic awakening. But I don't expect that coming out of this, we're suddenly going to have gender equality. But I would certainly put that in my personal preferred future. Some other awakenings that I'm hearing about are this is very specific to the US, but there are huge racial disparities in health and well-being. We are discovering that, unfortunately, Black Americans are dying at a higher rate than non-Black Americans. And that is highlighting massive health disparities in access and living conditions and where people live. And a fantastic outcome of this would be that we would be able to fix those health disparities. But again, just having that knowledge, many people have had that knowledge for a long time, isn't going to change it in and of itself. So similarly to tracking or uncovering incentivizing systems of change, I would want to understand, just because we now know this is a thing, we now know, people have known about it for a long time, but just because it's more common knowledge, who's working to change it? How is the cohort of organizations and people who are working to change it bigger than it was before the pandemic or the shutdown? And then two other awakenings. One is that despite the fact that artists are now all literally starving, except for the ones that are already mega millionaires, people are realizing life without art would be just, I'm saying boring, but it's beyond boring. It would be maddening. It would be so dull, because now that we're all shut in, we're spending all our time, if we don't have toddlers running after us like I do, reading books, watching movies, enjoying music. We are engaging in art and creation. And yet we have spent a long period of time cutting out funding for arts and supporting artists. Another awakening is that a slower pace of life can be nice. People are appreciating that they don't have to wake up to an alarm clock and commute to work and spend, in the Bay Area where I am, 2-4 hours commuting a day. These are all great awakenings. I would not bet $1 on the fact that any of them are going to turn into real action after this, just based on the fact that people are realizing this and saying it. And then the last point is to pause and listen. And so this is directly related to, in my life as a foresight strategist, the work has always been to create new scenarios, create new stories about what the future could be, what the future might be. I think trying to do that right now is a fool's errand, because the level of uncertainty is something that I don't think any of us have experienced, unless those of us who have lived through the Great Depression, World War II, just thinking of more recent massive moments of uncertainty. And nobody knows. I mean, even the forecasting models of what's happening in terms of current contagion, they are constantly updating, and they're not real. They don't know what's happening next week. They don't know what's happening 2 weeks from now. So trying to actually put a stake in the ground in terms of what you think that long-term impacts and outcomes will be right now is a fool's errand. What this does offer us is a chance to just pause and listen. That's why I love that the summit is called the Great Pause. And in order to make sense of new possibilities, in order to make sense of transformations and changes that are underway, we need to constantly gain wisdom, gain understanding of how the world works. And the only way to do that is to stop reacting, to truly listen, and to take in new information without putting our own biases onto it, without trying to problem solve it, without trying to answer. And every time we make a scenario, every time we tell a story about a possible future, we are problem solving, because we're trying to create patterns and find answers of possibility. And remember that the future is not a destination. It doesn't actually exist. It is a tool for us to use. And so there's no mad rush to figure it out, because it's not real. But take this time to pause, to listen, to learn about what's happening, what people want, what people need, what people desire. And from that, build your new actions. And, I say that with a caveat that if you are in an organizational or business context where you are looking for new opportunities, if there is something right in front of you that you feel really strongly about that this moment allows, go forth and do it. But don't beat yourself up. Don't stress about the fact that you don't have the answers now, because quite frankly, nobody does. This is the time to pause and listen. And so with that, I will stop and take some questions. Let me also just look at the chat here. All right. Let me open up the Q&A. So this is a bit of a long question, excuse me while I read it. So as someone who has experience leading systems change, I've had to use seeds of change, some of whom were not necessarily people who agree with me, to leverage the next step. Okay, and so what's important for those who are like me, Claire, who's a Black female, is to be able to see both the next step and the light at the end of the tunnel and gather fellow travelers on the road. Yeah. So what techniques have you found in your research that might help outcasts, outliers, and outlaws like me, who have good ideas to get out of the status quo and get heard? Okay, Claire, great question. I mean, you're asking a really fundamental question around social change and change making, and there's no straightforward, easy answer. I mean, it is truly about pushing forward. And, you know, I don't know if getting heard is what you're trying to accomplish as much as maybe it is building whatever it is that you want to have change and leading with that, leading with the offering, leading with whatever it is that you are trying to influence. Ideas are, we all have ideas. The real challenge is in actually making change. And so I might just focus on, rather than trying to get heard, building what it is that you want to see. And of course, I realize that's a little bit of a challenge because you need to be heard at some level to be able to build it and to get the support that you need to take it to the next level. All right. I'm having an issue with my mouse and actually scrolling the Q&As. Let me see. Okay, here it goes. So there's a question on how to avoid wishful thinking and creating scenarios. Or do we leverage wishes to create scenarios that lead to desirable futures? Yeah, that's a great question. And the way that I approach strategic foresight is to, you always want to begin with understanding a range of possibilities. And I shouldn't just say I mean, this is the field writ large. And so whatever context you're working in, with whoever you're working with, they're always going to be pushing forward with whatever future they want. We all have that in mind. There's always some official future that we want to move forward with, whether that's some sort of positive social change thing, whether it's just constantly earning more money, more revenue. We all have these kinds of wishful scenarios in mind. The trick is to first understand the whole landscape of possibilities. And once you've gone through that exercise, then you can start to funnel back into, well, what is your actual vision and where are you trying to go? But I wouldn't recommend doing that in this very moment, right? That was my whole talk was saying, let's pause for a while and just listen and learn. And so that would be another thing in terms of avoiding creating wishful thinking scenarios is listen, pause and listen without putting your own judgment. Try and truly deeply understand what is it that people are doing. without putting any kind of bias or judgment on it. So there's a question on how much do I think veganism and wellness, compassion practices, charity, those are 4 different trends, if you will, I suppose, are also push factors in this crisis. Well, I don't know if I can speak to all veganism, wellness, compassion practices, and charity, but I would say, one interesting thing that going back to the 120 plus scenarios that came out of just the 5 articles, I don't think any of them talked about the connection to environmental degradation and massive urbanization, hyperdense urbanization. There were some that talked a little bit about climate change and how young people are going to tie climate change to what's happening. But there is certainly an opening for veganism or vegetarianism or wildlife conservation to take advantage of, it's a weird phrase perhaps in this case, of the pandemic. So I would probably think of them a little less as push factors and a little more as, I would want to understand what are the incentivizing structures underneath that would actually lead us in that direction, as opposed to it being somebody's wish fulfillment. So here's a question. What types of signs can we look for to know that enough of the new work has solidified that we can now consider the future? That is a really good question. I don't think for me it's that enough of the new work has solidified that we can look for, that we can now consider the future. It's, what I'm trying to say is that we're just in such there's so much uncertainty. I mean, we don't even know if a lockdown is effectively going to end in a month, or if we're really talking about 2 years of on again, off again lockdown. We don't understand how that's going to impact everything from how we socialize to how we teach to how we work. And so it's just a time to pause and to listen. And maybe in 2-3 months, things will be clearer. And maybe in 2-3 months, things will be equally confusing and complex and uncertain. And we realize we need to pause some more. I would certainly say, if there is a vaccine in place and we have some sort of systems in place to deal with pandemics, because others will come, maybe this crisis will have been overcome to some extent, and we can feel like we're not going to enter into this level of uncertainty again as a result of a pandemic, but something else may come along. All right, next question. You mentioned digital governments as a push factor. What did you mean by that? I think I missed it. So I mean to say that there's been a lot of movement to have government become more virtual, whether it's voting virtually, whether it's legislating virtually. And now governments are in a position where they have to do that. And so it's been underway, and now they have to do it. They're being forced into it. So when we come out on the other side of this lockdown, some of that's going to remain. I doubt that government will be fully virtual when we're able to gather again, but some of the ability to have a virtual government, a digital government, is going to remain. And so that's a place where I would certainly look to longer term transformations. All right. Another question here. Is this invitation to listen to realization that we humans have less control over our futures? That is a very provocative question from you, because my whole career is, of course, based on saying we have control over our futures. The future is what we build. It's not just something that happens spontaneously out of thin air. We literally create everything that we see and do, and we create the stories and the narratives that feed into the systems, that feed into the realities that we live in, work, and love within. So it's not to say that we don't have control over our futures, but it's to say that we are in such a moment of disruption that trying to determine what the long-term impacts will be in the middle of the disruption is a fool's errand. It's a better time to listen as deeply and learn as much as you can, so that once things settle down a little bit more, you'll have a stronger kind of, you'll have a stronger sense of what the long-term impacts might be than somebody who wasn't paying attention. They were just reacting. But ultimately, this is also, you know, just to add that futures thinking is ultimately about building the world that we want to live in. And so this is an opportunity. This time of mass disruption is an opportunity to push forward with ideas that are sound, and ideas and convictions that we have about the world that we want to live in, if indeed you have them. But if you find that you're just in this moment of, I don't know what's happening and I don't know what to do, you're probably like the vast majority of us. And that's okay. It's okay to just sit with that for a while. Okay, next question. Yeah, my organization insists on ideation to try to figure out how to pivot our ventures products. What should we focus on if imagining the future is not possible? Yeah, I mean, it's this is the ultimate challenge, is that it's a challenge, and it's an invitation to take this time to focus less on open-ended ideation and more on understanding what's changing and what's happening. Now, an ideation is not necessarily the same thing as futures thinking. So you could have a session just brainstorming all the new opportunities that you see. And if people are interested, if people are into it, if there's energy around it, there's no reason not to do that. But if your organization is anything like most people I talk to, we're dealing with a lot of anxiety right now. And ideating about what's possible ultimately does force you into being in a futures orientation. And that can bring up a lot of anxiety as well. And so you have to approach it really carefully. And I've, before joining Dolby Laboratories, I've done a fair amount of futures work within conflict settings. And there's the same kind of uncertainty that exists within conflict. And so you have to approach the future very, very carefully in that kind of a context. You have to be very cognizant of the fact that people have real anxieties and fears about what the future might bring. And so you don't want to just jump into something about the future without considering that. and then entering into it carefully, making sure that it is the right time, that people are in the right mindset. All right, we have one more question. Recently attended a UNESCO event called Global Futures Literacy Design Forum. And one workshop centered on philosophical, physical, psychological, and social health. And the question is, how could we re-educate in thinking widely about our well-being? Yeah, so there is a fair amount of conversation around well-being in this moment, since we are dealing with mass trauma at various levels. Obviously, people who are in healthcare field, who are dealing with lost loved ones, are going through very, very real trauma. And I hope that there are some real solutions to addressing that trauma, rather than just moving past this as though it's all fine once our markets reopen, essentially. But I would generally put that kind of thinking in the step of uncovering incentivizing or enabling systems. So it's a great idea. Wellness is a great idea. We love it. Is the foundation in place for that kind of a transformation to happen? Are there incentivizing systems in place for schools, for companies, for governments to focus on psychosocial, philosophical, and physical health? And if not, then where would that come from, and who's building it? And if there's no change in who's working on it and who's building it, then I would probably not see this as a natural outcome of the pandemic, but as something that the pandemic is highlighting as necessary, and that there's work needed to build it.